Hello and welcome to India Speak, the Center for Policy Research's podcast. This is the second edition of our special series on unpacking the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic's second surge on India's economy, polity, and society. I'm Yamini Aiyar, and joining me today is Mahesh Vyas, Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy. Today with Mahesh, we will discuss the impact of the pandemic on India's labour markets. Particularly, we will look at what happened in March 2020 when India went into lockdown, its impact on employment patterns, how these changed when the unlocking happened in 2020, and finally, getting a deep dive into the shifting patterns of employment starting from April 2021 when the second wave hit India. Mahesh, thank you very much for joining us and looking forward to learning from you. I wondered if you could start our conversation by perhaps asking you to reflect on last year. What did we learn about the impact of COVID-19 on the economy? And more specifically, how did it reframe the structural dynamics of India's labor market?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me again to this show. What did we learn from our experience last year? I'm not sure whether we have learned enough. We seem to have got several things wrong, but at least from an economist's point of view, or a data monitoring machinery point of view, or the science of economics point of view, I think one thing is very clear, that it is very important to monitor the Indian economy very closely, very carefully, continuously. It is not a good idea to do surveys once in a while. It's not a good idea to stop measuring the health of the economy ever, because you don't know when you will be struck by a lightning. And if you don't have the data to know how bad it is or where it is bad, then you are quite handicapped to take the appropriate decisions or interventions to repair the damage. So it's quite likely for a long time you may be in denial because you just don't believe such a thing could have happened. Or you wouldn't like to imagine the ill effects of such a terrible thing to have happened. Whatever be the case, if there is no feedback, if we do not know exactly what the situation is, then we are seriously handicapped. So the biggest lesson to learn is that it's very important to measure. And I think I feel quite gratified that we did have a survey in place before the pandemic hit us, before demonetization hit us, and we could see the impact of that. So this comes from my profession, but nevertheless, that doesn't diminish the importance of monitoring, measuring regularly, continuously, and not doing it just in a one-off manner. Now, this is the first thing. The second thing that I will say is that when a thing of this kind happens, then state capacity is critically important. Of course, state capacity includes the capacity to collect data, but state capacity is required a lot more. I think we have been very short on state capacity. We require to build very strong state capacity. The liberalization process, which was to correct some limitations of the way Indian economy was organized, that liberalization of 91, 92, that did lots of good. Decontrol of prices, for example, decontrol of distribution, delicensing, freeing the capital markets from controls of the government. I think all these were wonderful things. Reducing barriers to trade was also very nice. But one of the things that happened along with this, and happened later on with the FRBM also, is that we started believing that we want less of government. I think that's a lesson mislearned. We don't require less of government as much as we require an effective government. We require state capacity for markets to work well. So I think that's a very important lesson. We have found state governments or the state as a whole, including central government, to be woefully inept in these times. So I would pause at these two. These are the two most important lessons that I have learned from this. We require a stronger state capacity, and we require to measure uh, the economy more closely, more continuously.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, and especially the fact that we celebrated, I think, too prematurely the prospect of India growing at night while the state sleeps, only to realize, perhaps at the worst time possible, that India can only grow so much when the state sleeps. We need the state in order to be able to ensure that India grows taller, stronger, and well. And that's most certainly one of the most critical lessons that we need to take from the traumas, rather, of the last 2 years. But let's come to something your work has and CMIE has really taught us, that in fact the nature of the labor market itself can be affected very, very significantly when there are serious economic shocks. We've all been with bated breath, waiting to see week on week what the CMIE data tells us about the health of employment in the Indian economy. And it's only when we get into those micro details do we really get to see whether the big macro decisions that we take for the Indian economy actually have an impact on people's everyday lives. And I think especially last year in April and May, when the economy froze, it was CMIE data that first brought home the extent to which the decision to save lives over livelihoods, as it was being framed back in March 2020, resulted in stripping people of sources of livelihood, and created a significant dent in the ability of the Indian economy to employ its workers. So perhaps if you could give us a sense of how the employment patterns panned out from the peak of the lockdown in April and May, and what happened then once India began to unlock and reach the phase towards the end of the year where we felt we were at the end game of the pandemic.
Sure, the pandemic came as a shocker for us as well. Um, when we saw the data that came in immediately after the lockdown, we were honestly shaken enough to hold back the numbers for a week. We didn't believe what we saw because we had never seen anything of this kind. And we thought that maybe something is wrong with our numbers, maybe something is wrong in the way we collected the data, or we didn't collect the data adequately. What we saw in that last week of March was that the unemployment rate had shot up to 24%. We had never seen a number like 24% unemployment rate in India. And we thought something could be wrong. This can't be true that there is 24% unemployment rate. We were used to numbers like 7%, 8%, and we would say, "Oh my God, that's too high." Uh, in the olden days, anyone who said that the unemployment rate in India was higher than 3% or so would be raising serious eyebrows. We said when we started monitoring this in 2016, we said the unemployment rate in India is close to 6%, 7% or so. And then the PLFS also told us it is 6.1%. And they said it was a 45-year high. But you can imagine what this means. When at 6.1%, the country was kind of getting crazy over a number being so high that it is a 45-year high. What do you do when you get a number like 24%? You freeze. And we waited for another week and saw 24% again and again. And we said we have to be honest and release it. If we get some brickbats, we'll see what happens. But our systems were right, and the unemployment rate was really 24%. Then, when all the numbers came in, we realized what actually happened when the economy was frozen. We learned that the labor participation rate crashed,
Mhm.
and the
Mahesh,
unemployment
sorry, I'm
rate.
going to stop you there just to explain to our listeners the difference between the unemployment rate and the labor participation rate, because for the uninitiated, that's not always obvious.
So the labor participation rate is the proportion of people who are more than 15 years or more, who are willing to work. So if you take all the people who are 15 years and more, and from there find out who are the people who are willing to work, the ratio of those who are willing to work to the total population of 15 and above is the labor participation rate. This number globally is around 55%. For us, it is now down to about 40%, was never better than 45% according to us. Now, of these people who are willing to work, some get employment, some don't. Those who don't get employment, although they try to get employment, as a proportion of all those people who are willing to work, is the unemployment rate. So I repeat, the labor participation rate is a proportion of those people who are willing to work to total population. When I say total, I always mean 15 years and above. Of all the people who are willing to work, some people don't get jobs unless, although they are looking for jobs. Now that is a small sliver, about 7%, 8% or so, as a proportion of all the people willing to work. So in the unemployment rate, you only consider those people who are willing to work. If I am educated but I want to stay at home and just do whatever I like to potter around at home with, I'm not counted into the labor market. So what happened is that when the lockdown came in, the labor participation rate crashed, which means people said they are not even looking for work because there was no work around. Now, India's biggest problem that I see is not the unemployment rate, because our unemployment rate is honestly speaking not very high. We get 24%, but it's usually around 6-7% or so. Our problem is a very low and falling labor participation rate. And the biggest damage that has happened to India because of this pandemic is that a falling labor participation rate has stepped down very sharply and continued to fall. So imagine a sliding graph, gradually falling. 44% becomes 43, becomes 42, becomes 41. And then suddenly it drops a big amount and then continues to fall. That's what has happened to the labor participation rate in India. My numbers were not exactly correct, but let me read out the numbers to you for labor participation rate. So we were at 46% in 2016-17. We were at 44% then at 43%, continued at 43%. So 46, 44, 43, 43, and then we dropped to 40%.
Ah, that's
Now
in
that was the big
2020.
fall. 2020, yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
And we are continuing to fall. So this lesser and lesser able people willing to work is the biggest problem. Why does this happen? Because India doesn't generate jobs adequately for people to come out and work and look for work. So what happened is the labor participation rate fell, and yet the unemployment rate was high, which means even for those lesser people who were coming out to look for work, they were not able to find jobs. So we saw a very large fall in the actual people employed in the month of April, April 2020, and then it rose gradually. But mind you, the total people employed in 2019-20, before the pandemic,
Mhm.
was 403.5 million.
Right.
Today, we are at 390.7 million. So even today, we don't have the kind of employment that we had before the pandemic. The best we reached was 400 million. That means even at the best point in the recovery process, we were 3.5 million short of the people employed before the pandemic. So the the COVID-19 pandemic has given us a lasting hit. There hasn't been a complete recovery. We have taken a hit, and we are suffering that hit even now. Instead of more people getting employment, less people are employed even today compared to where we were before the pandemic.
Absolutely. And I've seen a lot of analysis coming out using the CMIE data by different researchers that also point out that even in the peak 400 million, which we reached, if I'm not wrong, it was in November, December, where we saw that there's also been increased informality and a significant drop in female labor force participation. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, all the unit level data that we gather in this survey is made available to researchers, and many of them have put it to good use. And Amit Basole, Rosa Abraham, and their colleagues have all produced State of Work in India, a very nice report. And in that, and papers done by them even earlier, show that people who had formal jobs after the lockdown have moved to informal jobs. And there's a significant shift towards informality, is what they show, because the CMI survey is a panel survey and a continuous survey. A panel survey means that we were interviewing a certain set of people, 174,000 households, and we go back to the same households and ask all the questions all over again. And we do this thrice a year. So what researchers have done is they've seen that cohort before the lockdown and seen what has happened to them after the lockdown. And by doing this, they have found out that people who had formal jobs earlier now have informal jobs. People who had um, jobs where the income level was of a certain level, the average income level was of a certain level, have moved to other occupations where the average income levels are lower. So this is like an entire shift that I was doing something which gave me a certain standard of living, and I lost the job and I went to a place where the average incomes are lower. So you can see that there's an increase in informality and there is a decrease in potential earning capabilities of the households. Now, besides this, we have also seen that the incomes have come down, average incomes have come down for households. So the impact of the pandemic has been significant on informality. Now, the second point that you alluded to is women, and I think that's now it looks like is a pattern. I saw that in 2016 when there was demonetization. We saw that the biggest hit was young women who left the labor market. It was stark. And then, when there was a little shocker in GST times, again, there was the recovery process of women coming back to the labor markets was halted. But then we see the impact of the shock in the lockdown again, that women left the labor markets in a big way. So, usually researchers try to understand labor participation rate by age. And if you draw a graph of age on the x axis and labor participation rate on the y axis, you get an inverted U, which means that at relatively younger age, the labor participation rate is low. And as age progresses, the labor participation rate rises. Now imagine a U curve going, an inverted U curve going up. Then it stabilizes at say around age 35 or 40 and so on. And so at 30, it stabilizes. Then it remains a plateaued labor participation rate. Then as age progresses, say beyond 50, 55, that curve starts falling again. So like an inverted U, it remained high for some time, then it falls. Now, what we saw is very happily in the initial surveys that there was always a spike of female labor participation rate in the 2025 age group. We saw that for two or three consecutive waves before the demonetization event hit us. And what happened is that cohort or that age group rather, 2025 just collapsed. Women in that age group just quit in a big way. So that spike in that U curve suddenly fell down and went on falling down for a long time. Then it started rising in 2019. Mind you, 2016 through 2019, it kept falling down. Wave after wave after wave, we found that young women were increasingly less likely to come into the labor market. You got me? It's increasingly they were falling off the labor market in that bracket 20 to 25 and even 25 to 30. After 30, we see a blip in female labor participation rate because that's when they're childbearing and taking care of children at home. So they do fall and come back a little afterwards. But in 2019, we happily saw 2025 age group starting coming back again. And when the lockdown hit us, it collapsed again. And it fell all the way down. And I saw that this doesn't happen to men. The same curve can be drawn for men. And for men, this 20, 25, 25, 30 age brackets do not see a similar fall. So it's very clear that when you have an economic shock, men do not fall off the labor market, but women do. We need to ask a question why. Why is it that this happens? I will look forward to researchers investigating that a little and finding out why. I have some conjectures, but I think it's best for researchers to work on that. And some researchers, Afridi, etc., have worked on these problems and they're still working on it.
Yeah, in fact, this is one of the biggest puzzles of the Indian labor market. The drop in female labor force participation, and equally the fact that women seem to take the hit from an economic shock far more than men do. And once there's recovery from that shock, actually women find it harder to find sustained employment when they are pushed out of the workforce. And this is one of the important findings from the CMIE data analysis that Amit Basole and the Center for Sustainable Employment have done as well, where they found that men were able to come back and find some form of sustained employment from August through to December last year, whereas the percentage of women who managed that was far lower. So this is perhaps one of the most significant consequences of the COVID-19 shock as well, and one of the deepest structural barriers in our labor market that we need to understand a lot better. But Mahesh, if I look at where we are today, in some ways, April of 2021 is different and yet a little bit more of the same as April of 2020, in the sense that the uncertainties are back, lockdowns are back. And in this scenario, the lockdowns are supposed to have been devised in a way that would preserve the livelihoods and help ensure that we didn't find ourselves in the same place that we were in last year with the world's severest, harshest national lockdown. So we went for a model of state lockdowns and micro containment, as the government says, which is sort of smaller areas within cities, within districts, within regions that lock down based on the nature of surges. And the other significant difference, I think, between last year and this year is that rural India is also experiencing more COVID than there was any last year, where the lockdown impact was much more significant in cities and far less in rural areas. So from that perspective, inevitably we were going to expect some drop in employment for April and May. But could you give us a better sense of what you're learning from the surveys for these last 2 months?
You're right. There is a significant difference between the nature of the lockdown this time compared to last time, and the impact is therefore correspondingly different. When we had that nationwide lockdown in April 20, the segment that suffered the most was the daily wage earner. And small traders, daily wage earners were the ones, and even small business people suffered a lot. They suffered job losses in a very big way. This time, at least the April data, and we have to wait for the May data to come out as yet, but the April data does not show any fall in small traders and wage laborers. There is next to no fall in that. It's a stable number, which means that the daily wage earner could go out and do odd jobs. Maybe his or her income did fall, but there wasn't any headcount number fall in those laborers. What has happened though is that the structural, rather macroeconomic damage that the lockdown has had on the Indian economy is having an impact on salaried employees. So what we have seen is that in April, the salaried employees are the ones who lost the jobs most, and they were mostly in rural India. So it's not your city guy picking up his bag and going to work in the morning, not that guy. So this is more likely a blue collar MSME worker in rural India who's taken the hit.
Now that's significant because last time the rural economy held up the end of the economic hit and was very much part of our recovery story.
Yes, and this time it doesn't look like that. So now in the month of May, we saw unemployment rate shoot up in the weeks that we are measuring to 14.5%, and the last week was 14.7%. But rural unemployment rate is 14.7%, 14 point something, 14.5% or so, I think. Now, this is not the rate that rural India is supposed to have. I mean, unemployment is a slightly more urban phenomena and not as much of a rural phenomena because people go to their farms, although rural is much more than farms. But there is some disguised kind of employment, which is actually disguised unemployment, kind of employment is available in rural India. In urban India, if you're unemployed, you are unemployed. You can't go and sit in a farm and say, I'm doing some work. So I think rural India has clearly taken a much bigger hit this time than the last time round.
Right. And that also perhaps means that safety nets like Narega are not as expansive this time round as they were last time round, right?
They have to double up.
Hmm.
So I don't think the same amount of effort that they put in last time is going to work this time. So I think the effort will have to be a lot more, and I do not know what is going to be the face of this. In the month of April, the investment or the person days employment generated in Manrega was of the order of 340 million. The last time I saw the site, that number changes every day. 340 million person days is not a small number. So I think they are still putting money into Manrega, but I think they require to put a lot more. In spite of that, we are seeing 14.5% unemployment rate in rural India, which
Yeah,
is high.
which is really significant. But let's turn to another important indicator of the economy, which is consumer sentiment. We also know from the way in which COVID has spread, at least from the data that's available from Bombay, for instance, we know that it's spread amongst the higher income brackets in the high-rise buildings much more virulently. Many of those spenders or those consumers were also another end of the economy that was holding the flag up for India and enabling recovery with pent up demand that we saw particularly towards the end of last year, early this year. I know that you track consumer sentiment as well. So could you give us a sense of what we are learning? Anecdotally and from a few reports I've seen, it seems that consumer sentiment is also moving closer towards non-discretionary spending rather than discretionary spending. So could you give us a sense of what you're learning there?
Consumer sentiment numbers are a lot more depressing than the unemployment numbers.
Mm.
So CMI has been measuring consumer sentiments since 2016.
Mm.
We had the base for this index in September December 2015. So during September December 2015, we had a base and it was 100, and we have been tracking consumer sentiments with that base of 100. What has happened since September, December 2015 is that this index has kind of moved around between 97 and 107, 108 or so. When it touches the 105, 107, it means sentiments are now improving. But the sentiments haven't really improved much since 2016. I mean, a rise just to around 105 or 107, even 110, is not much to write home about. What happened after the pandemic is very revealing. The index fell to nearly 50. and then down to below 50.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we say that the index has fallen to 50 or below 50, what do we mean by this? And I don't think it's enough to just say that the index has fallen to 50. It's important to understand what is underlying this index. So let's take one number, and that will tell you a lot. There are five questions that go into the making of the index of consumer sentiments. One of them is, what is the status of the income of the household compared to a year ago? Has it been better? Has it worsened? Or is it the same? Now, traditionally, we got an answer to this was that 30% or so of the people, 35% or so of the people would say that it has improved. It is better than a year ago. And about 50 or so percent would tell us that it is the same as last year. So around 15% or less than 15% would tell us that it is worse than a year. This used to be the situation. This used to go up and down a little bit. 30 would become 35 or 40, and 15 would become 8 or 10 at the negative end. The latest number is that only 3% of the households tell us that their incomes are higher than a year ago.
Wow. Hmm.
And 55% of the people tell us it is worse than a year ago.
Hmm.
And just around less than 45% tell us that it is the same as a year ago,
Mm-hmm.
which means that more than, and this is in nominal terms, nobody adjusts their income for inflation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That means more than 97% of India's households are telling us that they have become poorer compared to a year ago. This is, the real impact of what the pandemic has been. We can say the unemployment rate is 14%, 10%, and so on and so forth, implying that just around 14% of us are stressed out. The rest of us have got jobs. The problem is, even those guys who have got jobs have got lesser paying jobs, as Amit Basole and his team tell us. And here is another indicator. We ask you, in a nominal sense, in a normative way, tell me, are you earning more or less compared to a year ago? And earlier, 35% people told us that they are earning more than a year ago. And today, only 3% people tell us that they are earning more than a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Even anecdotally, we know that companies have, in fact, either cut down wages or or mostly announced that there will not be any increments for this year, no bonuses for the previous FY. So I'm not surprised it's coming out in the data, but when you put it like that, one really gets to see it as starkly as it is. Which brings me to the constant conundrum that our policy debates sort of go back and forth on. Supply versus demand. Is the challenge or the nature of the economic shock that COVID has presented to us one that needs to be resolved through a supply side stimulus, or one that needs a demand-led response? And at least I think on the back of pent-up demand and spending that the economy was witnessing of the higher income households back towards the end of last year, early this year, and the fact that companies were also moving towards more of a profit-led recovery model, there seemed to be some comfort amongst our policymakers that the supply side push that they gave through monetary policy was going to help India come back to health. But I have seen CMIE's investment data, which paints a far bleaker picture. And I did want you to reflect a little bit for our listeners on what we're learning about the nature of private investment in India, both pre-pandemic and over the last year, because ultimately you need investment to generate jobs and to generate income for people. So that if we have to go back to a virtuous cycle, then understanding the trends in investment will also be very crucial for us.
I guess, if you ask industry for any idea on how the economy should be revived, they most likely will tell them that, look, our tax rate is so much higher than our neighboring countries, competing countries. So reduce the tax rates over here, and you'll see things will work. And billions of dollars can come into India, and then we will be a happy country forever. So I think the government bought the idea and reduced direct tax rates a couple of years ago. But if you had asked economists, and you would have heard that unless there is demand, nobody is going to invest. That's elementary. So the fact is that demand isn't growing fast enough, and capacity utilization of the Indian industries, according to the RBI's OBICUS, the survey that it conducts, has been telling us now for several years that the capacity utilization in the last, I think, 5 years or so did not cross 74%. And today is around 66% or so. Unless that capacity utilization crosses the 80% or 85%, nobody is going to invest additional capacities. If they are not going to invest into additional capacities, there's going to be no source of additional good quality jobs. So I think this needs to be understood. And I think the problem is that even in the pandemic, the government has apparently taken a stance that the solution to the problem is providing liquidity support to enterprises. I don't think that's a complete solution. I don't think it's even the starting of a solution. The problem was not enterprises. Many of them were flush with funds, and today they are very flush with funds. The problem is in people losing jobs, people losing their livelihoods, and seeing salary cuts, seeing income cuts in a very big way. Take cognizance of that and fix the demand side. If the demand side is fixed, then the supply side will get fixed automatically. So I think the problem, instead of reducing, I would say reducing um, indirect taxes or some taxes that the consumer pays. Because direct taxes for households is not enough because it impacts very few. It's a small sliver of the consuming markets. You require to have an impact on the economy as a whole for demand to pick up again. And there isn't enough that we have done to spur demand. What we have done on the demand side is more kind of band aid to ensure that people don't bleed too much. That's it. But that doesn't help revive demand. It only helps people not fall off into a debt trap. And now we are falling into a debt trap. So we're only stopping those things. We're not actually solving the problem. We need to understand the macroeconomics of this. It's not about targeting government spending, it's about spending, period.
Absolutely. And as you say, the death trap that we are now falling into is also going to be the reason why much of India will fall into an even further debt trap. Let's not forget that 50% of India is, as the World Bank describes, vulnerable population, which means a single income shock will likely push you back into poverty. And that single income shock for much of India usually is a health related shock. So the COVID related health shock that is pushing us into a death trap is also going to push families even deeper into debt traps. And we really do have to find our way out of it. And as you say, Mahesh, there's no other way of doing it than to spend our way out of it. Which brings me back in a sense to where we began this conversation. And I think that's the point at which I would like to sort of ask you to reflect further as we come to a close on our chat today, which is that, one of the reasons why policymakers take the positions that they do and can get away with it in a sense is because we actually don't have, as you rightly said at the start of our conversation, a good enough handle on the everyday life of the real Indian economy. As you say, COVID has highlighted the weaknesses in the Indian state capacity in ways that no other shock has for the globe to see in some senses. And one really crucial element of that state capacity is our statistical systems. When I talk to people who are in the public health domain and who are sort of trying to track the disease transmission and dynamics of the virus, you constantly hear them making a very similar argument to what all of us in the economic policy space have been making for a long time. Where is the data? How can we make policy if we don't have the data and the evidence? And we need to be able to strengthen our data data systems in order to be able to regularly monitor the dynamics of the virus, where it's surging, how it's peaking, vaccines, etc. So data really is at the heart of it, and data is very much at the heart of how we understand the Indian economy and what kind of policy measures we need to deploy. You've been engaged in a dialogue with the government, sometimes on a friendly plane, and at other times sparring on either side of the table around how we can better improve our statistical systems to have government-led data on what's happening to the everyday life of the Indian economy that can be corroborated with data from panel surveys like the CMIE. What are the three urgent things that we must do coming out of this pandemic as we hope eventually to start rebuilding to strengthen the government statistical system to be able to get better to understand the heart of the Indian economy?
I'll make one, if I may say so, correction to your question. Your last phrase was, what can be done to strengthen the government statistical system? I'll say, what needs to be done to strengthen India's statistical system? It does not have to be government anymore. Till yesterday, I almost call it till yesterday, till the pandemic, I believed, and to an extent, I still believe, that data being a public good should be produced by the government. And it has the best ability to collect that data. But I am now coming around to the view that I guess it's not the best solution. And even in an area like labor statistics, which can be done through a household survey and even an enterprise survey, if there are good capabilities which are professional and innovative, effective in the private sector, then it is better for the government to work with the private sector on this. So if the if the if CMI, for example, is producing an unemployment rate or labor statistics which are reasonably credible, and the government can have an oversight of its kind to see if it is credible or not, then it should just adopt it. I don't see any reason why we should be hung up with saying that only the government can produce this data. Today, CMI also produces the most comprehensive statistics on investments, but also on the behavior of the corporate sector, which goes into the national account statistics today. But if the national account statistics uses the CMI data set, it will do much better than what it is doing on its own. So I think the time has come to think out of the box on how the country's statistical systems can be improved. Now, this is one. But two, let's go a little ahead on the same theme. CMI is a private organization and is funded through subscriptions to its services. So somebody has to pay for the work to get done, and CMI sends its hat around to say, give us a subscription so that we can go and collect the data. But what CMI has done, and I think the government of India should take this as a lead, that it has said that the unemployment rate and some associated data is actually a public good. You don't pay CMI to see what the unemployment rate is. It's publicly available. Now, there can be a reasonably large set of similar data that CMI can be persuaded to make public. And the government and similar organizations should happily use it. Have an oversight to check if the data is of good quality or not. With that, the government of India can focus on other things where companies like CMI cannot produce data. I have tried over the last several years to reach out to the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and I've met some wonderful people over there, well-meaning people over there, who were in agreement with what we were doing and were keen to learn from what we have done and share their experiences, in spite of their best intentions. Multiple chief statisticians have failed to take advantage of what CMI was offering them. So the problem in, into quotes, correcting the government statistical system is a much bigger problem than just extending a hand of cooperation to a company like CMI or any similar organization that collects similar data. So I think it looked like for many, many decades that nobody can do what the NSSO does. It just so happens that technology has changed so dramatically uh, that it is possible for a private organization to do a survey which is comparable and in some ways better than what the NSSO does. So I think, and multinational agencies also need to look at this experience of private sector coming in to actually create public goods. So I hope I'm making myself clear. I'm saying that I don't want to say the government of India should do X, Y, and Z. I'm saying
Mhm.
something much simpler. Join hands with the private sector to actually take advantage of it. Why rebuild all this?
So, a public private partnership for building the country statistical systems. That's one innovative way in which we can jump through many of the hurdles and weaknesses within our current statistical system to be able to get to the end good, which is the core public good, high quality data that gives us deeper insights into the everyday dynamics of the Indian economy. That's how, Mahesh Vyas, you're thinking about where India should head?
Yes, and I'll put an asterisk mark to that.
Uh-huh.
When one says public private partnership, what many in the government say is that, okay, we are outsourcing the collection of data to you, but all the processes are ours. All the thinking is ours. You just do the execution, and they get it wrong. It's not the execution. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot more than that. So it requires a partnership which is not sequential, that I am telling you what you should do. It is more than that. It is come together, put the heads together, think together. And if something is done outside, just take it. Just take it as it is. Don't say that we are doing in partnership. Just, for example, the government of India can just start saying, okay, we believe what the CMI is saying, that the unemployment rate is 14.5% today, and move on. Let's now fix the unemployment problem. Rather than saying, I will tell CMI how it should collect unemployment data and then it will collect for me, give it to me, then I'll release the data. So it's a little more involved, what I'm saying. But I think it is time for us to recognize that many private organizations, look at SkyMet, for example. We have an IMD, which is India Meteorological Department, but we have SkyMet as well. SkyMet is entirely private. And SkyMet tells us that the monsoon will hit Kerala on 31st of May. We listen to that. So there are many places where taxpayer money can be saved and private agencies can come in to improve the statistical systems in a big way.
Mahesh, that's a provocative and interesting way of thinking about the challenge of our statistical systems, one that raises many questions and many possibilities as well. I hope we can have a longer debate about this in a future conversation, but trust you to be provocative and to make us think innovatively and differently about many of these age-old problems, even as you shed such critical light into helping us, even as you said, such critical light into different aspects of the Indian economy. Thank you so much for what has been such an insightful and provocative conversation. Really, really appreciate the time you've taken and the patience with which you've explained what we've learned about the Indian economy over the last year and what we are currently confronted with as we confront the tsunami of the second wave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on the show.
Thank you for listening. For more on CPR's work on COVID-19, you can follow us on our Twitter handle at CPR_India. and visit our website at www.cprindia.org. Next week, we bring you the third in our special series on the COVID-19 second wave and India. We will be talking with Dr. Abhijit Chaudhary of the Liver Foundation to get a better understanding of how COVID-19 is unfolding in rural India and what policy steps we should take to tackle the pandemic as it enters the hinterlands of India.